Hello, everyone. I think there's still a few more attendees trickling in, but we'll get going. We've got a number of speakers lined up, so I think it's important that we get started on time. First of all, I would like to welcome you to this webinar addressing the urgent need to cut black carbon from Arctic shipping, which is organised by the EU-funded project Arctic Black Carbon Impacting Climate and Air Pollution in collaboration with the Clean Arctic Alliance. I'm Sian Pryor. I'm the lead advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, which is a coalition of 21 non-profit organisations campaigning for the protection of the Arctic from the impact of shipping activities. I will be moderating the webinar, as well as starting off with a few words to introduce the webinar and our four speakers. Later on, I will also set out some options for future actions to reduce black carbon emissions impacting the Arctic. Then we'll move to a panel session and respond to questions from the audience. First of all, a couple of housekeeping matters. They are up on the screen as well, but please note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available afterwards. And secondly, if you have any questions, could you please use the Zoom Q&A option, which is usually at the bottom of your screen. If you can indicate to which speaker a question is directed, that would be helpful. And you can submit your questions at any point during the webinar, but we're going to leave all of them until the end, till the panel session, to respond to them, unless there is something really burning that needs to be addressed as we're making progress. If time runs out, hopefully it won't, but if time does run out, we will try and follow up with a response after the event. Today's webinar is going to present the latest information on black carbon emissions from shipping, which impact Arctic climate and air pollution. It will provide perspectives from a variety of stakeholders on continued review and mitigative actions to consider black carbon emission reductions under the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, and other international and regional bodies such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Arctic Council and the European Union. In addition to me speaking, we will hear from four speakers. They are Ludmila Osipova with the International Council on Clean Transportation, Andrey supporting the Inuit Circumpolar Council's delegation to the IMO, John Bradshaw with the World Shipping Council, and Caitlin Wells with Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm going to start off saying a few words before I introduce the first speaker. If we could have my slides, please. Thank you. I'm going to start with just a very quick recap on why we are concerned about black carbon emissions. We could go to the next slide, thank you. Black carbon is a short-lived climate pollutant produced by the incomplete burning of fossil fuels. It has an impact over 3,000 times that of carbon dioxide on a 20-year global warming potential basis, and it makes up around a fifth of international shipping's carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. When released near to the Arctic, black carbon has a disproportionately high impact. Not only does it contribute to warming while in the atmosphere, it accelerates melting if it deposits onto snow and ice. The melting snow and ice exposes darker areas of land and water, which then absorb further heat from the sun. The reflective capacity of the planet's polar ice cover, the albedo effect, is severely reduced. More heat in the polar systems results in increased melting and a feedback that contributes to Arctic amplification of climate warming. It is also an air pollutant that has a negative impact on human health, including respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. Next slide, please. The Arctic is a major climate regulator and is now considered by scientists to be warming as much as 4 times faster than the planet as a whole. It's an important ice habitat for wildlife with unique ecosystems supporting a huge productivity of plant and animal life in the oceans. And it is a highway and provides cultural identity for the Inuit people and other indigenous communities. But we are losing Arctic sea ice. at a rate of around 13% per decade over the last 40 years, and the older multi-year ice is disappearing. This has unprecedented consequences for global biodiversity and for the loss of the Inuit homeland. Next slide, please. It is now 16 years since a paper recognizing that black carbon is a potent climate forcer was first submitted to the IMO's Marine Environment Protection Committee. Then in 2010, 3 member states proposed that the IMO addresses black carbon by examining measures which would significantly reduce emissions from shipping having an impact in the Arctic. And at that time, it was envisaged that the reductions of black carbon could provide a short-term climate response that was considered to be absolutely necessary to forestall a climate tipping point and could provide breathing time for the needed reductions in CO2 to take hold over the longer term. Supporting the proposal from Norway, Sweden, and the United States, the UN Economic Commission for Europe Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, or Air Convention as it's known, in 2011 urged the IMO to take active steps to reduce emissions from shipping of black carbon in the Arctic region, to improve public health, particularly for indigenous Arctic populations, and to slow the rate of warming. It recognized that action could be performance-based, requiring a specific emission reduction, or technology-based, such as requiring the use of low-sulfur fuels and diesel particulate filters when operating in the Arctic. It also acknowledged that a technological approach was probably easier to verify. 10 years ago, work was presented to the IMO from the Arctic Council's Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Programme, or AMAP, which showed the significance of close to Arctic and within Arctic sources of black carbon. In this work, the Arctic was defined as all regions north of 60 degrees north. This proposal to the IMO in 2013 concluded that emissions of black carbon north of 60 degree north were more significant than emissions at lower latitudes, and that this should be taken into account when establishing potential mitigation action for black carbon. 5 years ago, following the release of an intergovernmental panel on climate change special report on global warming, the UN's Environment Programme reiterated that fast and immediate action on short-lived climate pollutants, including black carbon, can avoid a 0.5 degree of warming by 2050, and such action will also avoid over 50% of the predicted warming in the Arctic by 2050. Thereby significantly decreasing the chances of triggering dangerous climate tipping points. I could have the next slide, please. Back in 2010, or 2011, when the work started, the IMO agreed to a 3-step approach to address shipping source black carbon impacting the Arctic. The first step, to define black carbon, took a lot of debate before settling on a widely accepted definition. The second step was to agree how best to measure black carbon emissions, and has resulted in 3 principal methods being identified. And the third step, addressing the control of black carbon emissions, remains ongoing. We'll hear more on this work from John Bradshaw shortly. The IMO is currently developing guidelines on recommendatory goal-based control measures based on the work undertaken to date. It was as early as 2010 that a study for the IMO on Arctic ship black carbon abatement options identified the 5 most promising abatement methods, which would deliver immediate cuts of Arctic ship black carbon. The 2018 update of the study by one of the original authors stressed that the fastest option by far, and of particular relevance for shipping's black carbon impact on the Arctic, is an immediate shift to distillate fuels. Further workshops, working groups, and correspondence groups have operated over the years and have now evaluated a wide range of potential control measures, including changes to fuel, exhaust gas treatment systems, engine and propulsion system designs, and other provisions such as shore power, but without any decisions around concrete actions. Further consideration of mandatory measures requires concrete proposals to be put forward. Next slide, please. In the meantime, the IMO has adopted other measures which are relevant to the work on black carbon. In 2021, a revision to MARPOL Annex 1 was adopted to address the risk of heavy fuel oil spills in the Arctic. The Arctic HFO prohibition starts to take effect from July next year and will eventually ban the use and carriage of heavy fuel oils as fuels in that part of the Arctic that is covered by the IMO's Polar Code, but not until July 2029. And that's assuming that all states applied the provisions, which is not currently the case. The IMO has also adopted a resolution which urges member states and ship operators to voluntarily use distillate or other cleaner alternative fuels or methods of propulsion that are safe for ships and will reduce black carbon emissions from ships operating in or near to the Arctic. Next slide, please. Eventually, last year, an IMO correspondence group reduced a long list of potential black carbon reduction regulatory measures to 6 and identified those that can be applied to all existing ships immediately, which would include options such as a fuel switch or designation of emission control areas, and those that would require further work, such as a fuel standard or engine certification. The full list of 6 is on the slide. I'm not going to read them all out. Further discussion of this short list at this year's meeting of the IMO's Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee was limited, but IMO member states have now been called upon to present concrete proposals for regulatory measures to the next meeting of the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee in early 2024. Other efforts are underway to address shipping's biodiversity and climate impact globally, and some of these will result in reductions in black carbon emissions. A recent workshop organized to explore the interface between energy efficiency and underwater radiated noise from shipping identified that the strengthening of the IMO's carbon intensity indicator and efforts to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide and deliver the newly adopted IMO greenhouse gas targets are likely to involve greater use of slow steaming and moves to wind-assisted and even full wind propulsion. All of these should reduce underwater noise, as well as reducing emissions of both carbon dioxide and black carbon, but over time. Next slide, please. The IMO isn't the only international body concerned about the impact of black carbon emissions on the Arctic. As mentioned earlier, the UN Air Convention and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have both emphasized the threat to the Arctic and global processes from short-lived climate pollutants, including black carbon. And in 2017, the Arctic Council adopted a pan-Arctic collective aspirational goal to reduce emissions of black carbon by between 25 to 33% based on 2013 levels by 2025. This followed the adoption in 2015 of a non-legally binding agreement or framework that set out a common vision for Arctic states to accelerate the decline in black carbon emissions and to significantly reduce methane emissions. Observer states to the Arctic Council are also encouraged to participate in the implementation of the framework, which includes an assessment of progress every 2 years. The third progress report, published in 2021, announced that the Arctic states were on track to reach the collective goal of a 25 to 33% reduction in black carbon levels by 2025. And during the Arctic Council Icelandic Ministerial in 2021, ministers committed to possibly updating the goal at the next Arctic Council Ministerial meeting. Disappointingly, the progress made in achieving this goal is not reflected in emissions from the shipping sector. In fact, emissions of black carbon in the Arctic have increased in a similar time period, but we'll hear more on this from the ICCT presentation shortly. And then finally, the Nordic Council has also committed to action on atmospheric emissions, recommending in 2021 that emissions reductions from heavy fuels should be achieved through the designation of emission control areas in the Arctic under MARPOL Annex 6, and that Nordic countries should completely ban the use of heavy fuel oils. I'm going to stop there and introduce our speakers now, and I'll start with our first speaker. If we can change the or stop my slides, thank you. Our first speaker is Dr. Ludmila Osipova. Ludmila is a marine researcher at the International Council on Clean Transportation. Ludmila's expertise lies in the analysis of large-scale shipping data and the evaluation of measures related to the environmental and climate impact of the shipping sector worldwide. She is going to talk to us on black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping, a review of the main emitters and time trends. Ludmila, you have the floor. Are you okay to share your slides?
Thank you, Sean. Yes, give me a second. Can you see my slides?
Yes, all good.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you everyone for joining the webinar. As Sean already said, my name is Ludmila. I work in the International Council on Clean Transportation as a researcher. And today I'm going to present our work on black carbon emission from Arctic shipping. We're going to look through main emitters in the Arctic and also time trends, because we did similar research back in the days. We have data for starting from 2015, and we had a chance to actually update this data and see what are the trends in the Arctic. So in this presentation, I'm going to walk you through our maps on black carbon emission in the Arctic. And then we look at the different ship types that are main emitters in the Arctic and what kind of fuels that contribute the most to black carbon emissions. And finally, we will look at the changes in black carbon emissions over time. So first, I would like to start with Arctic definitions, because it's not that straightforward as everyone could think. In this map, you see the purple color actually shows the black carbon density, black carbon emission density for 2021. And the lines on the map actually shows different Arctic boundaries depending on the definition. So the geographic Arctic, it's overall the overall color, like this purple color, that shows the geographic Arctic, which is all the area at above approximately 60 degrees to the north. And then we have also the IMO Arctic waters, which is a blue line on this slide, and that's defined at the polar code. Sorry. And you can also see some other lines, this green and red, that shows the AMAP and AHDR boundaries as defined by the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program and by the Arctic Human Development Report. So let's start with the geographic Arctic and look what black carbon emission trends we can see there. So as I already mentioned, this is the all the purple color. It shows the black carbon emission densities in the Arctic. We were able to identify approximately 9,000 vessels in the geographic Arctic, and these vessels emit approximately 1,500 tons of black carbon. As you can see on the plot on the chart to the right, these are the main vessels types that contribute to black carbon emissions, and fishing vessels is the main contributor, while the top three ship types, oil tanker, fishing vessels, and general cargo, responsible for half of the emissions in the geographic Arctic. We can also look into the types of fuels that contribute the most for the black carbon emission. So on this vertical plot to the left, you see the distribution of the fuel that burned in the Arctic. And as you can see, the main fuel in the Arctic that is the most common one is distillate fuel. It's And this fuel actually, it's approximately 30% of the overall fuel burned in the Arctic. And then we have on the second most common fuel is residual, which is expected, and then only little part, approximately 5% of fuel burned from the ship with installed scrubbers. And the least common type of fuels in the Arctic is LNG. Also on the pie chart, you see the actual contribution of different fuels types to black carbon emissions. And as you can see, the distillate is contributing the most as a most common fuel type in the Arctic. You can also look at from both perspectives, which fishing vessels and which fuels types are most common ones and contributing the most to black carbon emissions. And this is a top 5 emitters on this pie chart. And as you can see, fishing vessels use mostly distillate fuels and responsible for most of the emissions in the Arctic. And on the second spot, the oil tankers that actually mostly use residuals, and they are the second. Now we can look into IMO Arctic waters and see what time trends were observed between 2015 and 2021. Just as a reminder, it's the same map, showing that how many vessels we were able to identify in the geographic Arctic, and the IMO Arctic here is the blue line, as you can see, shows that actually the IMO definition of the Arctic capture only 22% of vessels and 27% of total black carbon emission. And this is excluding actually Baltic Sea, because it's not a part of any of the Arctic definitions. So what can we see as a time trend? So these are 2 maps side by side. One shows 2015 data and 2021 on the right side. So as you can see, the fuel use in the geographic Arctic doubled within this time frame, and as well as the black carbon emissions, while the distribution of the shipping and density of emissions look very similar between these 2 years. So we were able to look at how much black carbon emissions still coming from residual fuel and from all fuel, and you see the trend. So through 2015 up to 2021, we observe increase, 2 times increase in black carbon emissions in the Arctic, in the IMO Arctic waters. So the main sort of finding for this study was that residuals are still the most common fuel type at the IMO Arctic and are responsible for more than 60% of black carbon emissions. You can see that within this time frame, the use of residuals got a little bit lower while distillate grew a tiny bit, but overall the trend is that residual fuels are still the most common fuel type in the IMO Arctic and responsible for most of the black carbon emission. We actually did a study showing what kind of benefits we could expect from switching to distillates from residuals in the Arctic. And the benefits, as you can see on the map, these are the most common, we pick up the most common routes, shipping routes in the Arctic. These include just a representative ships like bulk carrier, LNG carrier, cargo ships, cruise ship, and container ships. So all kind of type of shipping that you can see in the Arctic. So we pick up randomly these ships, sort of representing what would be the most common route in the Arctic. And then we recalculated how much benefits we could observe if this ship switched from residuals to distillates. And you see that the switching to distillates it has a huge potential to decrease black carbon emission. It's between 50 to 80% for ships that use residual fuels now, and it can even reach a higher potential for LNG ships, but LNG fuel ships, but they have also other climate issues, like, for example, they have methane slip problem, and this has also very high global warming potential. So what is special about this particular representation is that we know that the distillates are available in ports, and actually the ships can switch to distillates overnight if there is a political will to do so, and it can bring tremendous benefits to the Arctic already today. So just to conclude, we find out that in the geographic Arctic, we have approximately 9,000 ships, and they emitted 1,500 tons of black carbon in 2021. And that fishing vessels, oil tankers, and cargo ships are the most common ships in the Arctic, and they're contributing 50% of all emissions, and mainly burning from distilled fuels. While if we look at the IMO Arctic waters, we know that it covers only 22% of these vessels and 27% of black carbon emissions in the geographic Arctic. And the black carbon emission in IMO Arctic waters have doubled since 2015, and the residual fuels remains the most common type of fuel used in IMO Arctic and the biggest contributor to black carbon emissions. So that's all from my side, and thank you very much for your attention. I'm open for any questions.
Thank you, Ludmila. That's fascinating. And as Ludmila says, if anyone has any questions, and I can see one's come in already, but please put them in the Q&A, and we will come back to them during the panel session. We're going to move straight on to our second speaker, who is Andrew Dumbrell. Andrew provides support to the Inuit Circumpolar Council delegation at the IMO, and he's going to provide a statement on Inuit perspectives on climate and health from black carbon emissions from shipping. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sean. And great presentation, Ludmila. I'll just share one slide here, just to give. This is a slide of Inuit Nunaat. Thank you for the invitation to participate today. As Sean mentioned, I'm Andrew Dumbrell, and I support ICC's shipping work, including at the International Maritime Organization. I'm connecting today from Algonquin Anishinaabe unceded territory outside of Ottawa, Canada. Because of a scheduling conflict, Lisa Kaluki Koperkwalik, president of ICC Canada, couldn't be here today. So she has asked me to read the following statement. Inuit are international people sharing common language, culture, and land along the Arctic coast of Russia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. Inuit homeland, called Inuit Nunaat, has a unique environment, geography, culture, and political context. Adverse impacts to marine wildlife and ecosystems in this area from climate and health pollutants may significantly increase as a result. Inuit Nunaat is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. These changes have unprecedented and significant impacts on people in the Arctic, especially Inuit who depend on the marine and terrestrial plants and animals supported by the coastal zones of the Arctic Ocean, the tundra, and the sea ice. The Arctic is Inuit home. The Arctic Ocean and its coastal seas not only serve as highways for Inuit over the ice in winter and in the open water season, but also are essential for harvesting, culture, and livelihoods. Shipping is an integral part of the Inuit communities in all the circumpolar regions. Inuit way of life is intricately tied to the Arctic ecosystem, and Inuit culture, knowledge systems, and the region's biodiversity are bound together. Inuit rely on marine transportation for the delivery of necessary goods and services. In many diverse ways, shipping and the ocean are the lifelines for Inuit remote communities. It is urgent and imperative to mandate the reduction of black carbon emissions from shipping in and near the Arctic, and Inuit homeland of Inuit Nunaat for all these reasons. Black carbon is a potent pollutant which has a significant impact within Inuit Nunaat. This isn't a theoretical issue for Inuit. Inuit homeland is rapidly changing before our eyes. Inuit didn't cause the climate crisis, but are the ones on the front lines dealing with the consequences. Here are facts about black carbon in the Arctic and Inuit Nunaat. Black carbon is 20% of the shipping industry's climate impact. Its emissions in the Arctic have doubled from 2015 to 2021 and are 5 times more potent a climate disruptor when emitted in the Arctic. Black carbon melts snow and ice, resulting in habitat loss and disruptions in Inuit harvesting, culture, and mobility. Rapid changes to the Arctic environment have major implications for the global climate system, contributing to severe weather events around the world. Particulate matter and black carbon can have health impacts on Indigenous coastal communities, increasing the risk of premature mortality from respiratory ailments. Arctic shipping has increased in the past years at a significant rate. This is not an exhaustive list of reasons to urgently mandate emissions reductions. Black carbon emissions will become even more urgent as shipping traffic increases further. More needs to be done to develop clear, concrete, and effective next steps for mandating black carbon emissions reductions at the international level. At the last IMO MEPC meeting, ICC urged IMO members to submit concrete proposals to PPR 11 to quickly mandate and eliminate black carbon emissions. ICC also encouraged the geographic scope of these proposals to be as broad as possible to ensure that all of Inuit Nunaat and near Arctic areas are included. To end on a positive note, there are good steps being taken by countries like Canada and Norway on black carbon. We will hear today about an Arctic emission control area in Canada, which would substantially reduce BC black carbon emissions and have positive impacts on health and environmental outcomes. Canada is also taking a relatively new approach at the IMO by including the consideration of Indigenous knowledge and the engagement of Inuit communities as integral to the development and success of their emission control area proposal. Canada's efforts to further its reconciliation agenda with Indigenous peoples and follow through on the mandate of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as UNDRIP, is part of the rationale for supporting the emission control area proposal and pushing for its success at the IMO. This should be an example to other states and international bodies on how to implement UNDRIP and consider Indigenous knowledge in the development of economic models and environmental protections. In this context, ICC would like to stress the need to have an accompanying equitable transition framework in place for measures like an ECA, or the build-out of renewable shipping fuels to ensure economic hardship does not occur, which would impact Inuit communities who did not cause the climate crisis but are being the most impacted. A just and equitable transition must align with UNDRIP, recognizing and implementing Indigenous rights and considering Indigenous self-determination and self-governance. An equitable transition in this Canadian case would ensure that any increased costs for the use of cleaner fuels are not passed on to disproportionately affected climate vulnerable Inuit communities. ICC understands that Canada has recently committed to developing this framework. Thank you, and I will do my best as a participant of the panel to answer any questions, but in some cases I'll have to go back to consult with Inuit leadership and can respond later after I've done that. I'm also able to elaborate further if there is time and interest on Inuit health impacts from shipping air emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And we very much appreciate you standing in for Lisa Kopokraluk. It's very, very good of you to do that. We'll move straight on to our next speaker. And thank you. I can see some questions coming in for the panel, which is great. Our next speaker is John Bradshaw, who is Technical Director for Environment and Safety for the World Shipping Council. He is a maritime regulatory specialist and marine engineer with a broad range of senior level experience with maritime engineering, technical and policy matters, including representing the shipping industry at the IMO. John is going to speak on black carbon mitigation, IMO progress and abatement potential. Over to you, John.
Thank you, and firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak at the event. That's very much appreciated. Hopefully you can all see my screen, and I'll go straight into it. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about black carbon tonight. Hopefully my presentation will be complementary to everybody else's. Certainly, based on the very good presentations, I do feel that we are all speaking very much from the same place. So I won't dwell on some of the stuff that's already been covered extremely well. So as we've heard, black carbon is a species of particulate matter, PM, with negative impacts on climate, local air quality, and public health, and all three of those things are important. And as we've heard, IMO started work on this at MEPC 62 in 2011, so it's been quite a long road at IMO, really. Current work is focused on developing recommendatory guidance to reduce emissions. But as I said, I should also acknowledge that this is part of a pathway to mandatory measures, and that we're also working on monitoring and reporting protocol. I was sort of, the purpose of my presentation is to address regulatory and policy issues. But because of the nature of black carbon, I'm gonna cover some technical issues, and apologies if this gets a little bit boring or dry. But because of the nature of black carbon, it is important to consider certain technical aspects. So the first thing is, what is black carbon? And IMO agreed to do the Bond-et-al. Definition, which I've reprinted here. That's a lot of words, so what I'll do is I'll go directly on to the next slide, because what does the Bond-et-al. Definition say? And really, I think what we can summarize it as is that black carbon is a species of particulate matter that's light absorbing, refractory, insoluble, and that insolubility includes organic solvents such as methanol and acetone, and it's small. And the reason I'm bringing this question up is because it's quite important, because the control measures are very significantly influenced by the physical nature of black carbon. For example, if we consider wet scrubbing, the fact that it's insoluble has implications for the design of a scrubber. They have to be designed for dry phase operation. And that obviously presents the whole issue of wash water discharge and management, which I won't touch on tonight, but whether that's acceptable is another question entirely. It's purely a technical observation on the design of scrubbers. So in terms of how we make BC, I mean, obviously it would be better if we didn't make black carbon. That would avoid the problem at source. But although black carbon is a species of particulate matter, it's important to say that not all particulate matter is black carbon. Not all particulates meet the Bond-et-al. Definition. And some of the things that influence the production of black carbon, the engine operating cycle, the engine design, and the load. The load is really critical as an influencing factor. The engine condition, a well-maintained, well-operated engine will have superior emissions performance to a purely maintained engine that isn't optimally operated. And both the fuel type and the fuel composition, so we've already heard the sensitivity of black carbon to fuel type, heavy oil, gas oil, stroke distillates, natural gas, plus those fuels that are going to be entering the industry in the years ahead. And also the fuel composition within those groups, and I'm thinking here of aromatic content. Aromaticity is variable within fuels of the same group. So some gas oils are aromatic, some gas oils are paraffinic. So as already stated, black carbon, we could eliminate it completely by just not combusting carbon-based fuels. And I think that's where the industry really needs to go as part of the wider greenhouse gas debate. We could reduce it by combusting fuels that are associated with lower emissions of black carbon, and using alternative energy sources like wind assistance, for example, by reducing the amount of fuel used, we would reduce the amount of black carbon. And then we have things like managing the engine load optimization, engine condition. And we have after-treatment options. I've already mentioned scrubbing, but maybe a more promising technology is diesel particulate filters, DPF. However, at the moment, current DPF technology does need automotive quality fuel, which is significantly different to marine distillates. However, that's not to say that DPF technology couldn't be developed to operate on marine fuels. And as some of you know, IMO is already working on allowing the industry to use diesels with a lower flush point. So I've identified a few discussion points here, and again, apologies if this is a little bit dry, but it is quite important in the context of discussing control measures. So IMO's identified 3 ways of measuring black carbon: the filter smoke number, light-induced incandescence, and photoacoustic spectroscopy PUS. All of them have a good correlation and all of them are effective. We could accept any of them. But there's no agreed emission limit volume, and there's no existing control regulation. As I say, the ultimate solution is to switch to fuels that aren't associated with black carbon, but that's going to need time. So we need to consider what we can do in the interim as the industry makes that much more fundamental switch. So some of the control measures, as we've discussed, are fuel switching, distillates, synthetic fuels, LNG, methanol, and ultimately carbon-free fuels. We could develop an engine test and certification scheme, and that would be equivalent to what we already do with nitrogen oxide emissions. We can optimize engine load, and all of the measured data agrees that BC emissions are highly sensitive to engine load. We could revise fuel standards to include aromaticity. It seems that controlling aromaticity can have a very positive effect. And we can look at exhaust gas after treatment, and DPF would be one of those. There's also proposals for things like electrostatic precipitators as well as scrubbing. But depending on which way we go, if we were to go down the route of engine certification and after treatment, we would almost certainly need to agree emission limit thresholds and a metrology standard so that we would be able to do verification. An alternative would be to work on the basis of agreeing mandatory measures that don't meet that measurement standard and emission limit values, but based on correlation. So we also have this discussion of mandatory versus recommendatory. And I think, well, everybody would agree that mandatory measures are more effective, but we have to be cognizant of where we are, and we need time to agree this. And one thing that's absolutely critical to understand, that after MEPC agrees a mandatory measure, an amendment to the convention, it has to be adopted at the following meeting. Then we have the entry into force procedure. So we're looking at 2 to 2.5 years from agreement until entry into force. And that's after agreement. So recommendatory measures are less onerous, less demanding, but they are something we can agree quickly. And something to say is, by itself, amending ISO 8217, the International Fuel Standard, to address aromaticity, that's not a regulatory measure. Although clearly the revised fuel standard could be referenced by a regulatory measure. Given where we are in time, we think that the current path to agree recommendatory guidelines as part of a pathway to a mandatory measure is the most appropriate way forward, because we need to make progress. And we anticipate that the end rate, the guidance, will be something equivalent to a black carbon stamp. So this is, I know I'm dwelling on this time question, but it is quite important. And the reason it's important is because if we want mandatory measures, IMO as an organisation has to reach an agreement on what to do. We're looking realistically at 4 or 5 years from now until we can get a mandatory measure into force. That means the organisation has to make its mind up and move towards a mandatory measure if we're going to do this. As WSE, we are very open-minded. All that we would ask is that measures are technically sound and effective. And it will be linked to the wider mission of IMO to reach zero near 2050. Yes, the quick word we do, while we are very open-minded, we do urge regulatory alignment. So if we go for an engine test regime to align engine test cycles with the NOx technical code definition, metrology standards are critical, and to be cognizant of other work such as the prohibition of HFO in the Arctic, existing work on NOx emissions certification, etc. So this is my final slide. We think the recommendatory guidelines, what we are sort of looking at as a BC-SEMP, it's a good short-term way forward. The longer-term solution is going to be linked to the wider work of IMO to reach zero emissions as part of the 2023 strategy. As WSC, we do support further work, including development of potential mandatory measures. We are very supportive of reducing the environmental impact of shipping. And that further work should pay attention to other outputs such as GHG midterm measures. As I say, I've returned to this question about time, and given the amount of where we are and what we need to do, we do need to be cognizant and make that decision on what we can achieve in the next 4 to 5 years. And if we want a mandatory measure, we just need to make that decision and get on with it. And that's the end of my presentation. Apologies if I've gone on too long or if it was a little bit dry, but hopefully that's sort of consistent with some of the other presenters, and thank you for that.
Thank you, John. And no, that was perfect. Thank you. And some very useful insights there. So I do appreciate it. Our final speaker, before I come back and say a few more words, is Caitlin Wells. Caitlin is currently the acting section head of the Clean Transportation team in the Energy and Transportation Directorate of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Her team focuses on decarbonisation and air pollution emission reductions for the marine, rail and aviation sections. Caitlin is also the lead for ECCC's on the development of Canada's Arctic Emission Control Area proposal. And Caitlin has a background in atmospheric science and has been working for ECCC for 8 years. Today, she is going to present an overview of some of the work focusing on black carbon from shipping, as well as provide us with an update on Canada's Arctic Emission Control Area proposal. Thank you, Caitlin. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm assuming you can see my screen.
Yes,
so,
perfect.
great. Thanks. So, as Sean mentioned, my name is Caitlin Wells. And I'll be talking today about a little bit of black carbon work, as well as talking about the emission control area that Andrew mentioned. So this is just an overview, repeating again what I'm presenting on today. So let's start with some of our black carbon research. So Environment Canada, or ECCC is often what I call it because there's so many C's, has 3 main areas where we look at black carbon emissions from shipping in Canada's Arctic. Environment Canada does do a lot of work on black carbon from other emission sources on land in different parts of the country, but I'm focusing today only on what we do related to shipping in Canada's Arctic. First, we look at shipping data and emissions through our marine emissions inventory tool. Some of you may have heard of this tool before, and it's a high-level version is available online. If you were to, there's a clickable link here, but if you were to Google Marine Emissions Inventory Tool, Environment Canada or Environment Climate Change Canada, you'd be able to come to the landing page. This high level version online is based on a bottom-up activity-based emissions inventory that calculates emissions and scrubber wash water discharge from every vessel that enters Canada's EEZ, or Economic Exclusive Zone. And one of the parameters it's calculates is black carbon, but there is a whole suite of parameters. It calculates heavy metal discharge. It also calculates what all the different air pollutants, climate change pollutants, etc. And this is an example of what it will look like online. So this figure is a screenshot of the black carbon emissions in the Arctic from the online tool. And this I've pulled is just 2019. And I don't know if some of you have used this tool, you'll notice that we haven't updated to 2022 yet. We have the data, it's in our database, so we just need to get it online. And so what you'll see here is there are emissions calculated for every location that a vessel is in the Canadian Arctic, or this actually is for all of Canada. And you'll see there's higher points of emissions of black carbon. For example, this is around the Baffinland iron mines. You can see that there's higher shipping traffic there, so we're seeing higher emissions of black carbon. You can also filter the data by province, by ship class, ship types. Let's say you only wanted to know what the merchant bulks were doing. You could then select that. You could look at different date ranges as well. On the online tool, there's a whole bunch of more of these little cards that you can then filter data in different ways. So with that data, when we get all the shipping emissions, there's a lot of research into black carbon that our teams, my team, as well as our science and technology branch and our Meteorological Service of Canada, they do a lot of research on the shipping impacts in the Arctic, as well as the black carbon impacts. And one of the main studies that is at the basis for the ECA proposal, or the Emission Control Area proposal, that I'll get into next, is a multi-year project looking at the impacts of ship emissions on air concentrations and deposition of pollutants in the Canadian Arctic, including black carbon emissions. So this study was published in 2018. Since then, there's been updates that haven't been published, but we've been working with those the different divisions within Environment Canada to get the most recent data for our Emissions Control Area proposal. So I'll highlight a little bit of the results from this study. And this is, complementary to some of the things that Ludmila was talking about, but we are focusing in directly on Canada rather than the whole Arctic. So like I said, these are from that study. And again, this is a hyperlink here, but this is the name of the study here, assessing the impact of shipping emissions on air pollution in the Canadian Arctic and northern regions, and it's published online. And so these plots show the percent contribution from ship emissions within the Canadian Arctic waters on black carbon deposition. And we're just looking at the main shipping period, or the summer months, July, August, and September. And we're looking at comparing 2010 to two future years, so a business as usual case, and what would happen if we imposed ICA type regulations. Of course, we have data, for this time spanning between 2010 and 2030. So for our emission control area analysis, we've done a lot of digging into what has happened between 2010 and present. And so you'll see here in these two cases, it doesn't look like a lot of reductions, but it is considerable considering just changing one little regulation. Again, we see a lot of shipping activity that is causing high emissions around the Baffinland area. And in 2010, we didn't quite see that. And so you'll see with an ICA type regulation in place compared to a business as usual, we can see a visible reduction in deposition of black carbon in the Canadian Arctic. So similar to deposition, we also need to look at black carbon in the air column because black carbon not only melts ice, it also warms the air, which can then accelerate warming and melting, as Sean was talking about earlier. So again, these plots are from the same study, and they're showing the percent contribution from ship emissions in the Canadian Arctic waters to the black carbon loading, again, over from July, August, September period. And again, looking at 2010, comparing to a 2030 business as usual and a 2030 emission control area case. So like I mentioned, we've been doing a lot of more research since this has been published, and we're finding that the actual contribution of black carbon emissions from ships is even a little bit higher than we anticipated. So having an ICA in place will show even more reductions than we found in this paper. And that's going to be presented in our eco proposal, which I'll get into. So as you'll see here, again, the changes by implementing the ICA, visibly, you can't see it as much, but we do look at the data, you can see a pretty big percent reduction in black carbon emissions between these two cases. So the third aspect that our team and our other teams that we work closely with at Environment Canada is we engage at the IMO on black carbon issues. So Transport Canada is our lead for everything at the IMO, but we support on that participation, especially when it comes to technical research or advancing different environment issues related to shipping. And a key area that we are supporting is, as we've been talking about a little bit today, is a Canadian Arctic Emission Control Area proposal. And that's what I'm going to get into next. And so now onto this proposal. So this is a shortened presentation that I normally do about the ICA proposal. And so I'm happy to answer questions after or talk one-on-one as needed. So first of all, looking at a bit of rationale, why are we even considering an emission control area? So first of all, what is an emission control area? And most people here might know this, but an emission control area is a sea area in which stricter controls are established to reduce airborne NOx and SOx emissions from ships. So nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides. And currently, the Arctic or the Canadian Arctic does not have an emission control area, but the rest of North America does. And the North American emission control area stops at 60 degrees north. But in the meantime, we've been seeing shipping increasing in the Arctic, and that means air pollution, including black carbon emissions and deposition of black carbon from these ships, is also increasing. Increasing pollution has impacts to health and the environment, as Andrew has been talked to earlier. And some of the emissions from vessels also have climate change effects, as we've been talking about today. The whole point of this webinar is looking at the black carbon emissions. Increasing pollution also has impacts to health and the environment. And some of the emissions are, like I mentioned, have the climate change effects. So not only the air quality is important here, but reducing the impacts of climate forcing pollutants. So let's look at a map of the proposal. This is a map showing the North American, or the existing North American emission control area in orange. So you'll see that right here. And then the added purple line here is the proposed Canadian Arctic emission control area boundary. So you'll see where the North American emission control area stops right about here at the very tip of 60 degrees. The proposal will join that, and it will follow the the EEZ boundary, or the marine boundary between Canada and Greenland. And then it goes up and around, and it's approximately 200 nautical miles out, and then it joins the 137th meridian in the Yukon Territory. You'll notice there is an offset here. And the reason for that is there is a well-managed dispute, a marine dispute between Canada and the US in the Beaufort Sea. And so we just need to be cautious of that. And our advice is that we need to go inland a little bit to avoid that dispute at this time. So as I mentioned before, we're seeing an increase in shipping activity in the Arctic. We can look at fuel consumption changes as a marker for emission changes. And albeit that some vessels use different fuels, as Ludmila talked about. So this graph shows an increase in fuel consumption from 2010 to 2019 in the Canadian Arctic from cruise, merchant, and tanker ships. And you'll see that fuel consumption has more than doubled in the Canadian Arctic, which is indicative of increasing emissions. For emission reductions. So we've looked at the potential emission reductions in 2030 as a result of an emission control area. So this graph shows the emissions in 2019. And I think previously I showed the study that had 2010. So we're kind of combining the information from that study as well as most recent data. And so we're showing 2010 as well as a 2030 business as usual case. So similar to the study I showed earlier, and a 2030 ICA case. So within ICA, we can see a high reduction of emissions from SOx, or sulfur oxides, total particulate matter, and black carbon here. So while visibly in some of those graphs I showed earlier, you weren't sure how much black carbon reductions we're getting, but some of the calculations we're seeing is it's about a 60% reduction of black carbon emissions from shipping by vessels switching to cleaner fuels in the Canadian Arctic. You'll notice the NOx reductions seem small in comparison, and this is due to the rate of introduction of NOx Tier 3 vessels by the 2030 scenario. The IMO's NOx regulation in an ICA stipulates that a vessel with a keel laid date has a vessel after the date of adoption around there, it will be specified in the proposal, will have to comply with the NOx Tier 3 regulation. So that means any older vessel that is then going into this new ICA wouldn't have to be a NOx Tier 3. And so as more new vessels enter the fleet, you'll see more and more NOx Tier 3 vessels, and then we'll be able to see more NOx reductions as we go further into the future. Okay, so some of the benefits, and I think we've talked a lot about what the benefits are to reducing pollution. Andrew touched to it, as well as others. So I'll just go over them here, specifically in the context of the emission control area proposal. So the ICA has the potential to reduce the warming effects of black carbon should the vessels comply with using cleaner fuels. So anything cleaner than a distillate or cleaner. An ICA would reduce the effects of air pollution, acidification, eutrophication in the Arctic, where critical loads are already being exceeded or exceeded. When sulfur and nitrogen land on the Arctic, there is a really sensitive ecosystem already to the changes in acidification and eutrophication. And so we're finding that adding more pollution to that, the deposition that we're adding to that is then exacerbating a critical load exceedance that we're already seeing. So as we've talked a lot about today, the majority of black carbon particles emitted in the Arctic are from sea level sources within the region, so including ships operating close to areas with snow and ice. So as Sean went over in the beginning, black carbon is accelerating melting of sea ice in the Arctic, and our ice environments in Canada's Arctic remain a critical habitat for a number of species, so including polar bears, walruses, reindeer, narwhals, and many others, as well as the indigenous population. Therefore, increased loss of sea ice in the region results in increased vulnerability to species and that directly depend on the Arctic environments. So Canada recognizes that it has a duty to ensure a healthy environment for all its citizens, not just the ones south of 60. And so on our journey to path of reconciliation with Indigenous people, we have to keep this in mind. So lower ship emissions will reduce impacts to culturally significant areas upon which Indigenous communities depend for their food security, cultural identity, way of life, and health, as Andrew pointed out. Lower ship emissions can help protect vulnerable groups, such as people with pre-existing health conditions, children, older adults, and people with lower socioeconomic status, which can be more sensitive to the adverse health effects of air pollution. So Ludmila mentioned the HFO ban a little bit. And so one of the questions that we get is, why do we need an ICA and an HFO ban at the same time in the Canadian Arctic? So there's a number of reasons why. The HFO ban is focusing on preventing spills and does not regulate emissions from the combustion of fuels, whereas the ICA is an air pollution reduction measure. Under the HFO ban, there are still options to comply with fuels that don't meet the standards of an ICA, resulting in higher emissions. Vessels are already encouraged to use cleaner fuels in the Arctic, and the ICA would help increase the use of clean fuels and technology in the sensitive area. The HFO ban does not include any regulations on NOx, whereas an ICA does. So this is an update on our timeline. So the ICAs take a long time to designate. So for example, the North American Emission Control Area proposal was submitted in 2009 to the IMO, but it wasn't put into effect until 2013. So we are currently getting close to submission. Right now, we are aiming to submit the proposal in December for the MEPC 81. So that's the meeting that we would like to have the proposal presented at. That meeting happens in March. And so if all goes to plan and we are able to get approval at MEPC 81, then we could potentially get adoption at MEPC 82 at the earliest. And then if we do get adoption, then Canada can start the process, including engagement on the actual legislation with the goal to have something like this into force in 2027. This 2-year process here, there'll be a lot more engagement. I know Andrew has mentioned that we've been working really closely with different Indigenous groups in the Arctic on the proposal, but the engagement is not over. This whole period here between 2024 and 2026 will include more thorough engagement specifically on how the regulation will look in the Arctic, as well as the aspects of the costs that Andrew mentioned. And that's all I have for you today. This is some contact information should you wish to discuss anything I presented today in further. So again, my name is Caitlin Wass, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. That's very interesting and very helpful. Just before we move to the panel session, I'm going to talk a little bit more, and I'm going to set out some ideas and proposals for future regulation of black carbon emissions from shipping in the Arctic or in and near to the Arctic. Please, I see we're getting plenty of questions coming in on the Q&A. Please, though, don't forget to submit your questions, and then we'll move to the panel shortly. Where do we go from here? The IMO has spent over 13 years now debating how to address the impact of shipping's black carbon emissions on the Arctic, but has yet to agree on any mandatory measures that will reduce emissions. Consequently, the shipping sector continues to emit an extremely powerful and very short-lived climate forcer that remains totally unregulated and is increasing in the region where it is doing the most damage. This is directly contrary to the rapid, deep, and sustained mitigation and accelerated implementation of adaptation actions this decade called for by the IPCC's 6th Assessment Report, which concluded that the likelihood and impact of abrupt and/or irreversible changes in the climate system, including changes triggered when tipping points are reached, increase with further global warming. And as warming levels increase, so do the risks of species extinction or irreversible loss of biodiversity in ecosystems, including forests, coral reefs, and in Arctic regions. So the Arctic was identified specifically in relation to those recommendations or those calls for action. So what can be done immediately? It's now understood that limiting the aromatic hydrocarbon content of fossil fuels is key to reducing black carbon emissions. And importantly, the hydrogen to carbon or HC ratio, or the hydrogen content itself. And this is probably the best indicator of a fuel's aromatic or paraffinic nature. Limits on the aromatic content of fuels that are used on roads and off-roads, in diesel-powered locomotives, and even in inland shipping fuels have been applied in both Europe and North America for over a decade. And in the case of aviation fuels, reducing the aromatic content leads to less soot at altitude, and thus an immediate reduction in contrails, which account for around 60% of the aviation sector's climate impact. The EU's Fit for 55 package of climate regulation has now mandated that from 2025, all aviation fuels must be tested for aromatic content, with a view to the Commission potentially capping and requiring reductions. The International Standards Organization has committed to proposing an indicator of marine fuels' paraffinic nature. This work must be quickly developed further by learning lessons from the aviation sector and developing a quick and straightforward test for a marine fuels' hydrogen-carbon ratio. And I think there are clearly some lessons here for the maritime sector and for the regulators. Next slide, please. At the IMO earlier this year, a clear call was issued to IMO member states to bring forward concrete abatement proposals for consideration when the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee next meets in February next year. The Clean Arctic Alliance has focused on the short list of 6 control measures identified through the work of an earlier correspondence group and mentioned earlier today. From our perspective, 3 of these 6 measures stand out and we feel should be pursued as a matter of high priority. The first measure is the switch to distillate approach. This is a simple change in fuel choice, which has been on the table for over 12 years now. It is already encouraged on a voluntary basis through an IMO resolution, and it is undoubtedly the simplest and quickest way in which black carbon emissions in and near to the Arctic can be reduced. It would see somewhere between a 50 and 80% reduction in black carbon emissions, depending on the engine type, age, maintenance, and load. Ships already switch backwards and forwards between heavier fuels and distillate as they operate in and out of emission control areas. And the use of lighter distillate fuels would facilitate the installation of diesel particulate filters, which would then reduce emissions further by over 90%. It would be important that such a measure be applied over a suitable geographic area. As indicated by ICCT and others' work, we think this should be all areas or all seas north of 60 degrees north, or potentially the waters that fall within the Arctic Human Development Report or Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Programme boundaries. Such a measure could be included in MARPOL Annex 6 through the introduction of a new black carbon specific regulation. We feel this really is low-hanging fruit. It doesn't need new fuels or new testing. It could be done very quickly. A second regulatory control option would be a polar aromatic fuel standard. A polar aromatic fuel standard could also be introduced via an addition of a new regulation to MARPOL Annex 6, and the benefit of this approach would be that the measure would be goal-based, and ship operators could determine how best to comply with the regulation. It would be necessary to know the aromatic content of the marine fuels, preferably by testing for the hydrogen-carbon ratio, and it would be necessary to establish a maximum black carbon threshold, as referred to by John earlier. And for us, all marine fuels that would mean that all marine fuels used in or near to the Arctic would have to comply with the specific hydrogen-carbon ratio standard. Initially, the threshold could be set based on the average performance of distillate fuels, but tightened over time, since ultimately the threshold for black carbon needs to be zero emissions. The geographic scope of the regulation would also need to be determined appropriately. And then the third measure is the development of a black carbon emission control area designation, or ABC-iCAP. This measure would also require a BC or black carbon threshold to be introduced via a new regulation in MARPOL Annex 6. The benefit of a black carbon emission control area regulation are that a designation could be developed by an individual country or by a group of countries working collaboratively. The designation could support other types of emission control areas. So, for example, a compliant fuel would need to meet both the sulfur limits and the hydrogen carbon threshold. There would be no need to define a geographic area for the measure, because this would be done by the countries bringing forward a proposal. And the designation could be used further afield to support reductions in black carbon emissions arising from further south. And a BC-iCAP could also be developed in a complementary manner to an aromatic fuel standard. As I mentioned earlier, work is underway to deliver greenhouse gas reduction targets too, including those agreed in the revised IMO greenhouse gas strategy. Reduction efforts involving life cycle assessments of fuels and revision of carbon intensity indicators should encompass carbon dioxide equivalents and therefore black carbon, and must lead to the decarbonisation of the shipping sector globally, and in the longer term will reduce black carbon emissions. But in the short term, there is an urgent need for measures that will reduce short-lived climate pollutants today, particularly those impacting the Arctic. And here are the three options that we propose that can do just that. Next slide, please. If we are to achieve the necessary rapid, deep and sustained mitigation called for in the latest IPCC report, then we are going to need more than IMO guidelines for ships. It is a travesty, really, that amid the clear and unfolding climate crisis in the Arctic, emissions of a potent, short-lived climate pollutant remain totally unregulated, and especially when the potential solutions for Arctic shipping already exist. Mandatory action is necessary to reduce and eliminate black carbon emissions in the next few years from all ships operating in and near to the Arctic, in such a way that the reductions available today can be realised today. Thank you for the last slide there. We're now going to move on to the panel session. But first of all, I would just like to say thank you to all of our speakers. I think that's been a really good suite of presentations, and I hope that sets the scene for some good discussion now. I see we've got quite a few questions have come in, and we'll come back to those in a moment. Could I please ask all of our speakers to turn on your cameras? I would also just like to say, please keep putting questions into the Q&A option. That's great. The names of the panelists are shown on the slide that is up at the moment. And in addition to our speakers, we are also very pleased to welcome on the panel Mr. Richard Mason, who is the European Commission representative to the IMO and participates in all of the IMO committee and subcommittee meetings. I've got a couple of questions myself as well to get us started. And just to bring Richard in at the beginning, I'm going to start with a question for you, Richard, if that's okay. And the question is, maybe you could just explain what role the European Union has in efforts to regulate black carbon emissions from shipping in the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sian. And first of all, thank you very much to all the presenters. That's been very, very insightful, very informative. Thank you very much. As you say, I'm the Commission's representative to the IMO. In terms of the Commission's point of view, we are very concerned about the negative impact on the environment and climate of black carbon in the Arctic region. And indeed, that's reflected in our EU Arctic strategy. For us, despite the lack shall we say, of a clear-cut EU legal authority or competence on black carbon from ships. At IMO, we tend to promote the coordination amongst EU member states at the IMO on the black carbon topic as far as we can. We just have to ensure that member states are willing to go forward. Some of them are more reluctant than others, but we normally try to get and do get a position, a supportive position on black carbon. We have had the success of the HFO ban in the Arctic, and also just the resolution to encourage ships to use distillates rather than the heavy fuel oil on a voluntary basis in the Arctic waters. And indeed, in that case, yes, we did push for the chair not to continue to postpone that particular resolution, but to actually take it and get it adopted. We have actively engaged in ensuring all ship emissions are reduced at all levels, regional and global. For us, I mean, we see that there are sort of elements where we have, if we work in one area, then it has an impact on the other areas, such as emission control areas. And the creation of emission control areas, we already have them in the Baltic, in the North Sea, and in 2022, the entire Mediterranean. And at the moment, we're working on the Northeast Atlantic. We hope that that will also encompass part of the Arctic as well. So that is one element. There's also, just in terms of our Fuel EU Maritime, which is part of the Fit for 55, the Green Deal agenda, where we have a review clause that includes the possibility to consider black carbon emissions in a future revision of the regulation. At the moment, the reason why we don't actually have black carbon included in that was because there was insufficient agreement at scientific level, we found, as to the representativeness of black carbon emission factors across different conditions, fuel type, engine type, operating load, etc. But if that is agreed at an international level, then we are quite happy just to bring it in. We also have the new ship source pollution directive, the proposal. It's currently being discussed, and a review clause foresees the possibility to cover black carbon in the case of adoption by the IMO of relevant international instruments. Now, I can see from John Bradshaw's thing that international instruments take some time at the IMO. I know that full well. But if we get it, then we can actually apply it and enforce it at EU level. I'll leave it there. I'm sure there'll be questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for being put on the spot a bit there. So that was really helpful. We've got a whole range of different questions now. I've just been trying to look through some of them. We're going to come back to some in the panel, but first, perhaps, Andrew, you touched on Inuit health impacts of black carbon. Could you just elaborate a little bit on the health impacts associated with shipping air emissions and the significance for Inuit communities?
Thanks, Sean. You know, black carbon is a triple threat to Inuit and Indigenous communities. You know, a lot of attention gets paid to short-lived climate forts, are right, and local warming and global warming. And the second is habitat loss, local ice melt and speeding up local ice melt and deposition. And the third is health. And it doesn't get talked about quite as much, especially as the larger climate issue. And you know, the main pollutants in air emissions from shipping are sulfur oxide, nitrogen oxide, particulate matter, black carbon, ground level ozone, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. You know, sulfur oxide and nitrogen oxide can have severe impacts on respiratory systems. Particulate matter has a wide range of health impacts, including heart disease, neurological impacts, increased mortality. Black carbon is very similar. Ground level ozone is damaging to lung tissue, and PAH is linked to cancer. In the Canadian case, which I'm more familiar with, it's a more vulnerable population in the Arctic and in indigenous communities. Life expectancy is reduced by between 3 and 11 years, and rates of disease such as heart disease and mortality are much higher. As well, shipping occurs near coastal communities, and that's when we've heard about how potent some of these pollutants can be. And so you have indigenous communities on the coast and shipping in close proximity. So you have a wide range of pollutants in shipping air emissions. You have a vulnerable population. You have a source that's close to that population. You also have traffic increasing in this region. So the problem is just going to get worse, and Inuit and indigenous communities are on the front line of climate change. So their cultures and livelihoods and well-being are being disrupted by the climate crisis, something that they didn't cause. So this is a very real and immediate issue for indigenous and Inuit communities. And it really needs urgent action. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really helpful, really, really good. I just see that there's quite a lot of questions have come in and people have responded to in writing. I think we'll come back and revisit some of them in a moment. But Caitlin, I don't know if you've seen, there's a couple of questions asked of you that have gone into the dismissed column. The first one from Sangeeta Sharma about the deposition of black carbon on the ice map. You were showing a column loading for 2010, 2030 cases, but missed the deposition effect. And then a second question there from Vicky Peck about, well, just explaining some of what they're doing. Okay, that's more of a personal connection, but would you like to respond to either of those two questions?
Sure, Sangeeta. If you're the same Sangeeta I think I know who you are. I can send you my slide. If you want to send me an email from the contact slide, I can also put my email in the response. But we also, I think, in the attendees here, we have some of the authors of the paper that I presented on. And also looking at that paper, I believe it was sent as a link in the answered questions. Yeah, I think Joseph sent it, I believe, to that paper. So that will help answer some of the questions about the black carbon deposition map that I showed. I'm not going to share my screen again here, but I will put my email into here, and you can we can chat about that offline. And then Vicky, I know there used to be a monitoring station in Pond Inlet, and that's where some of this data, the modeling data, is being initialized from, is looking at the monitoring station in Pond Inlet. And I know that there's been some talk about, okay, what do we do now with the monitoring? So I'd have to connect you with the right team. That's not my team. So hopefully you saw my email up there, and feel free to email me, and I'll try to connect you with the right people about what's going on with monitoring in the Arctic. But I'll put my email in again into the Q&A.
Thank you. Ludmila, you've been responding to a lot of the questions that came in early on. Is there anything you want to sort of pick up and add in light of those questions?
Thank you, Sean. Just let me see. So I see there's a question on what is the effect of switching from residuals to distillates on CO2 emissions. And this is a really good question, because actually distillate fuel have like a slightly higher emission factors for the CO2 emissions. So that means that you might be expecting an increase in CO2 emission if you switching to distillates, but that's actually not the case. And we did some analysis on the potential of switching from residuals to distillates in the Atlantic Ocean, EU Atlantic Ocean. It shows that the CO2 emissions wouldn't grow because of the switch. So there's no concern here about that. And about the data that we use for this analysis, I think I didn't mention it actually in my presentation, but the data we used was the AIS GPS data, and we used that for shipping traffic analysis. And then we also use IHS market data for looking into the engine specifications and what type of fuel specific ships use by merging this data on the IMO number of the ships. And all methodology that we use is aligned with the fourth greenhouse gas study by the IMO. Yeah, there's also a question, very good question from Bradley Matches on trends for geographic Arctic. So there was a reason why we only talked about the IMO waters, because the geographic Arctic data for 2015 is missing. We did not do this analysis back in the previous research. There's something that we can do in the future potentially, but right now we have only the data for IMO waters in 2015.
Thank
Yes,
you.
also, yeah, this is good. The rest of the questions are addressed, and please feel free to email me if you have anything extra.
Great, thanks. I have a question that I've been asked actually, and I think a number of the panelists could probably answer it, but I'm going to suggest maybe John and perhaps Ludmila would like to consider it. What do you feel are the reasons that the use of distillate fuels is not growing in the Arctic? What are the sort of obstacles to all ships moving to distillate fuels?
Well, I see the main obstacle is the economic barrier, because to comply with the sulfur cap, you can use ultra low sulfur fuel oil. Sorry, just low sulfur. To comply with the ICAP, you can use ultra low sulfur fuel oil. So there is any economic incentives for ship owners to switch to distillates. So it should be a regulation.
Thank you. John, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's the answer. Ultimately, we do have to be cognizant of the fact that shipping is an industry, and where a fuel offers quite a significant economic advantage, if that fuel is acceptable legally and to regulators, then it's no surprise if many operators use that lower cost fuel. Thank you.
Thank you. I've had one question snuck into the chat for Caitlin, if I could just bring it up, Caitlin. The question is just wondering whether there have been any conversations with Canada's neighbours, particularly Greenland, about potentially extending the emission control area to cover the Davis Strait in between Canada and West Greenland. Thank you.
So we've been talking to Greenland a lot just in general about what we're doing, right? We want to make sure that our neighbors are aware and that there's not, huge impacts, to something we're doing domestically. When we talked to them, they weren't in a position to join our proposal at this time, but we've offered to help where needed on modeling or shipping data expertise should they decide to join. And I believe, Ludmila has been having conversations with Greenland as well related to the Northeast Atlantic proposal. So both of us are ensuring to engage Greenland, making sure they're aware of what's happening and offering help where needed to make sure that, they're not feeling left behind in this type of regulation. But at this time, we're going to go forward with a Canadian only proposal, but that's not the end of us working in the Arctic. We're here to help. We do a lot of modeling. We model a lot of the Arctic. And so we're here to help if anyone else needs to bring forward a proposal. We won't want to leave people behind. I don't know, Ludmila, if you want to comment on that as well.
No, that I think you answered the questions really well. I would say the same thing. So yeah, we'll work with Greenland closely, and we're really hoping in the active engagement in the North Atlantic ICAP emission control area establishment. So this is a work in progress right now.
Thank you. That's good to know. There's a question here, and I'm not absolutely certain who to direct it to. So it's from Sangeeta. It's still in the open column. Should we focus on carbonaceous aerosol in total rather than only black carbon? Is there anyone who would like to attempt to respond to that one?
I mean, if I catch on, that is really, it's a very valid question. Because clearly particulates in general are a significant public health issue, local air quality issue, and are associated with all sorts of deleterious effects. And if we look at the emissions profile of fuels, switching to distillates actually tends to have a much bigger impact on total PM than it does on black carbon. The emissions of PM from HFO are very high relative to distillates. However, I think we are where we are with regards to IMO, and at the moment that would require a new workout per IMO. It would have to reach agreement. I think we all know that's quite a protracted process. So that would delay things even further. So as things are now, whilst personally I do recognise it's a very valid concern and a point to make, if we want to reduce black carbon emissions, I do worry that that would be a further diversion and it would further retard progress. So sometimes it's better to accept an imperfect way forward that we can achieve than to strive for perfection that might actually delay the progress that we really need to make.
Thank you. That's a good point. And I think, you know, hopefully the overall decarbonisation programme that's underway as well will deal with some of the hopefully will deal with the carbonaceous aerosol problem too. Though some of the alternatives might still have issues, I guess, around that. John, I think the next question that's come in is probably your best place to respond to as well, about the typical price difference between residual and distillate fuel. Are you able to respond to that?
Not at the minute, no, I haven't looked at the spot prices for fuel recently. But as a rule of thumb, it's hundreds of dollars. We're not talking about $10 or $20 a ton. The spread can be several $100 a ton. So as I'm sure you can all imagine, if a ship, even if it's quite a modest size ship using 20 tons, 30 tons of fuel a day, spread of $200 to $300 a ton very quickly amounts to quite a significant sum.
Thank you. And I know the work's a little bit old now, but we did some work at the time that the heavy fuel oil ban was under discussion. And I know we were coming out with figures around the sort of 10 to 15% price difference of moving away from residual fuels to distillate fuels. But obviously the whole fuel scenario has changed since then with the introduction of the sulfur cap, and fuels have changed. So I'm not sure that those figures would still stand up today. But there has been a fair bit of work, I think, done on the economic aspects. Any more questions, or does anyone feel that they've asked a question and it's been answered, but they would like to have a chance to just have it responded to in verbally as well as in written format? Please just stick it into the Q&A quickly, and we'll come back to it. Otherwise, I think we may have covered most of the questions that have been raised. Would any of the panelists have any of the panelists got anything else that they would like to say or add?
Yes, could I ask Andrey, whenever we have coordination with our member states, just one of the things that they want to emphasize is to take into account any socio-economic impact on the Arctic population of any black carbon measures. Do you see just any kind of negative impact? I'd be interested to know, just so that I can respond to them a little bit more coherently next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. It's a good question. In the statement that I read, ICC and in Canada, other Inuit regions and across Inuit NewNet, are calling for an equitable transition when it comes to climate mitigation and dealing with renewable fuels and system change within the marine sector. One of the big reasons why the Pacific Islands are pushing for a levy within the greenhouse gas strategy is for that reason, is to support their states in the transition to renewable fuels within the sector. I think the same is true for black carbon mitigation and potential economic impacts. I think states, Canada has committed to offsetting the cost or developing financial mechanisms to offset that cost. Shipping is essential for remote communities, Indigenous communities. Goods are much higher priced. Many of them come on ships. So if you have fuel that's more expensive that needs to be used to cut down on black carbon, ways to mitigate those economic impacts are essential. And that's very high priority for Indigenous communities to make sure that you get that right. And there are benefits, right? The cost benefits around that, the reduction in spill cleanup costs, the reduction in negative health impacts, in reduction in habitat loss. So I think you have to look at that narrative from a full perspective and weigh those costs and benefits. But Inuit in Canada have been saying we need that economic piece along with clean shipping, right? They go together to make sure that communities aren't disadvantaged further from clean shipping initiatives.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We've got one last question, I think, and then we'll start to wrap up. Carla has asked about scrubbers, and if scrubbers used by the cruise industry, or presumably other scrubbers as well, are pulling black carbon out of the exhausts. From what I've seen, it's very mixed. There are some suggestions that scrubbers can lower the amount of black carbon being emitted. Some suggestions that they make, or some work showing that they make very little difference, and some work showing that they may even increase emissions. But I'm sure others might have views and like to come in on this point.
I can speak from some of the research we've done at Environment Canada, which also involved ICCT. Some of the research we've done was found that scrubbers actually, don't reduce black carbon emissions. They tend to mean it so that you can use dirtier fuels, and the scrubber is scrubbing out sulfur. It's not scrubbing out particulates, and it could lead to, compared to the use of distillate, the scrubber plus whatever fuel you're using with your scrubber could have an increase in black carbon emissions compared to a distillate. I know that Canada is working on addressing the issue of scrubber wash water discharge in Canada, but from our point of view, we're looking at other means of getting black carbon reductions, not the use of scrubbers.
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a common question, and it comes down to the design of the scrubber. A wet exhaust gas cleaning system, you can design it, optimize it for dry phase operation or wet phase operation, and it's possible to design it to operate on both wet and dry. And that's really quite critical on what the scrubber will remove. The vast majority of marine scrubbers are there to desulfurize the exhaust gas, and that means they're optimized for wet phase operation. If the scrubber's optimized for wet phase operation, it's not going to be effective at black carbon. That's just the way these systems are designed to operate. You can design a scrubber and optimize it for dry phase operation, and that would actually be very effective at reducing emissions of black carbon. What you do with the wash water is a completely separate issue. I'm very aware that that's quite a highly charged thing. So it is quite clear the technology can work if it's optimized for black carbon or dry phase operation, but currently, because the regulatory imperative is flue gas desulfurization, marine units are optimized for wet phase operation, and that's why we don't see this reduction in black carbon.
Thank you, John. And Caitlin, that was really good responses, helpful responses. Thank you. For anyone that's interested, I'm hoping that we will be organising a webinar around scrubbers and scrubber discharges later in the year. So we'll circulate information on that when we've got a date set. I'm going to start the wrap up now. If I could just go to the next slide, which I'm hoping has some closing remarks. Now, we've cheated a little bit with these because our panelists very kindly let us see their presentations ahead of time. So these closing remarks come from the presentations, but don't reflect necessarily the panel discussion just now. I'm not going to go through them in detail. They summarize the fact that black carbon emissions are still an ongoing problem, both globally and particularly in the Arctic. The involvement of indigenous knowledge and engagement with Inuit communities in the Arctic is obviously important or integral in terms of moving forward. Further action is needed. I think that's clear. It's important, though, that action and measures that are developed must be sound and effective. There are still clearly some hurdles that need to be addressed, some things that we don't quite know what the answer is just yet, but we're working on those and moving that forward. Urgent decisions are needed as well, because if we're going to do anything in the timescales that are necessary for the Arctic, we need to make those decisions now so that we can move forward in the right way. And clearly from Caitlin's presentation, that there are measures that already exist that can be used that will help. But I think it's also important that we have a regulatory measure that specifically addresses black carbon. And then finally, just we put out the proposals I referred to earlier as proposals, as options. And if there is feedback on possible routes forward on mandatory options, we would really welcome it. So just to wrap up then, I would like once again just to thank our speakers and panelists. I feel this has been really helpful webinar, really useful, very interesting. Ludmilla, Andrew, John, Caitlin, thank you. And also thank you to Richard for joining the panel. I'd also just like to thank the EU-funded Arctic Black Carbon Impacting Climate and Air Pollution Project for organising today's webinar in collaboration with the Clean Arctic Alliance. And finally, I'd just like to thank all the participants for joining us today. I do hope that you have found the discussion valuable and useful as well. And then I'd just like to finish by referring to some of the concluding words from Hans Otto Portner, one of the co-chairs of the IPCC report addressing impacts, adaptation and vulnerability that contributed to the IPCC's 6th assessment report. And he said at the time of the publication of that report, the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. I believe that these words must be held in centre mind for all further discussions of climate and air pollution, both within the IMO and within other frameworks as well. The Arctic serves as a regulator of global climate and other ecological processes through large-scale patterns related to air and ocean circulation. And the changes we're seeing in the Arctic today are impacting and will continue to impact not only the people in the Arctic, but the rest of the world. We need regulation of black carbon to help drive the rapid, deep and sustained emission reductions that are needed now. With that, I just say thank you to everyone and goodbye. Thank you very much.